The first thing I remember from my wedding day wasn't the dress, or the flowers, or even the moment I first saw James waiting at the altar. It wasn't the music, the laughter, or the perfectly arranged tables. It was my mother's hand. She came up to me just before I walked down the aisle, slipping past bridesmaids and photographers like a shadow, quiet and deliberate. Her hand was trembling, but she pressed something small and folded into my palm, something I could feel even through the delicate lace of my gloves. "And note, read this after the ceremony," she whispered, so softly that if I had blinked I might have thought I imagined it. Her lips brushed my cheek for just a second, leaving the faintest trace of her lipstick. I wanted to say something, to ask what it was, but the moment felt too heavy, too fragile. So I smiled politely, nodded, and tucked the note into my bouquet, a secret waiting for later. At the time, I thought it would be sentimental, a few words of motherly advice, perhaps a blessing, something simple and sweet, meant to guide me into marriage. Maybe even a tearful, "I'm proud of you." But I didn't know it would be the first thread unraveling the life I thought I understood. The ceremony was a blur of perfection. Sunlight streamed through the chapel windows, glinting off the gold and white decorations, and the smell of roses hung in the air like a soft promise. James looked at me with that steady, warm smile that always made me feel like I could breathe properly for the first time in days. I told my vows and listened to his, feeling my chest swell with happiness and hope. Everyone said it was beautiful. Everyone said I looked radiant. Everyone said the perfect bride glows on her wedding day, and I did. I glowed, or at least I believed I did, but the note waited, quiet, patient, innocent in appearance, but heavy with truth. It wasn't until the evening, after the music slowed and the guests began drifting away, that I finally allowed myself the small moment of privacy to unfold it. The bridal suite was empty except for a few exhausted bridesmaids who had moved on to their own celebrations. I sat on the edge of the bed, my gown pooling around me like a cloud, and pulled the note from its hiding place. The paper was thick, slightly yellowed, and smelled faintly of her perfume, a smell that always reminded me of childhood afternoons spent curled up on the couch with her while she read to me. My heart thumped as I unfolded it, expecting a line or two of heartfelt advice, but the words that greeted me weren't simple or kind in the way I had imagined. They were careful, controlled, afraid. The first line hit me with a strange, surreal calm. "You deserve to know the truth about your past." I blinked. My hands shook slightly. Truth about my past. My mother, who had always seemed so gentle, so protective, so careful to shield me from pain, had something she hadn't told me. I read on, and with every word, a slow, chilling realization began to settle in my chest. The man I had always called my father, my hero, my safe place, wasn't my biological parent. The story I had been told about why certain opportunities never came my way, why certain doors remained closed, why our family always seemed to function with invisible rules, had been edited, crafted, and repeated so many times I had believed it without question. My grandparents' inheritance. Redirected, my college fund reallocated, every financial and personal delay that had felt like life teaching me patience was, in truth, a carefully managed series of omissions. The note explained it gently, as if she were holding my hand across a chasm I hadn't even seen yet. She wrote about her fear of losing me, about her desire to protect me from pain she assumed I couldn't bear. She wrote that she had wanted to tell me sooner, but didn't know how, and in some ways she still didn't. I sat there in my wedding dress, staring at the words, expecting anger, expecting betrayal, a sharp sting of it like cold metal against skin. But it didn't come. Instead, what rose in me was a deep, aching grief not for the money, not for the opportunities I had lost, but for the innocence that had been quietly stolen. For the years I had spent trusting stories, believing in explanations that had never been fully true. I thought about every time I had been told to wait, to be patient, to understand, to let others' comfort take priority over my own. I thought about how easily my trust had been managed, how gently it had been bent to suit the needs of everyone else in the room. And I realized in that strange quiet that I had been living my life in someone else's carefully constructed story. The note ended with a single sentence that lingered in the air like a quiet challenge. I didn't want you to start your marriage believing lies. I just didn't know how to tell you sooner. I folded the note carefully and set it beside me, letting the words sink in slowly. The rest of the world went on celebrating, but for me, the wedding day had transformed. It was no longer just about vows and flowers. It was the first day I truly noticed the invisible strings that had held me, gently, silently, for my entire life. And in that moment, amidst the satin, the roses, and the fading applause, I understood that the path ahead wouldn't just be about building a marriage. It would be about reclaiming the story of my own life. After that wedding day, the note sat on my nightstand, folded neatly but heavy with its unspoken weight. I didn't open it again immediately. I couldn't. Part of me wanted to shove it aside, pretend it was just a mistake, that the carefully curated life I had believed in could still exist. But deep down, I knew it couldn't. In the following days, I found myself observing my family differently, seeing patterns I hadn't noticed before. Conversations that once felt natural now had an edge of calculation. Stories shifted depending on who was present. My mother, who had always been the warm center of our home, seemed practiced in how she smiled, how she explained things, how she redirected questions. I remember one afternoon, in the quiet of my parents' living room, I asked my mother about my childhood savings account. She smiled, the kind of soft, affectionate smile that used to reassure me, and said, "Oh, it was all for you, always for you," but I knew somehow that wasn't the full truth. There was hesitation in her voice, a pause she didn't know she made. And for the first time, I noticed the way my father avoided certain topics, how he deflected questions with a joke or a sigh, how he seemed to expect obedience rather than understanding. It wasn't a sudden betrayal, it was subtle, quiet. Slowly, a picture began to emerge, one that I hadn't been ready to see before. The note had mentioned my father's biological connection, or lack thereof, so I started looking for evidence in places I had ignored for years. Old photo albums, childhood mementos, letters tucked away in drawers, even casual remarks from relatives during family dinners. They had always felt like minor, inconsequential details. Now, each one became a piece of a puzzle I hadn't realized existed. I found photographs labeled with names I didn't recognize. Notes that reference people I had never met, memories that didn't quite align with the stories I had been told. And slowly, painfully, I began to understand. The life I had believed in was a story carefully edited for convenience. My family had made choices to shape what I saw, what I knew, and what I trusted. I felt an ache that was difficult to describe. Not just sadness, not just disappointment, but a grief for the years of unquestioning trust I had given them. I mourned the innocence that had been quietly tucked away, the version of myself who had believed in simple love and honesty. That part of me felt fragile, almost childlike, as if it had been quietly erased without my notice. And yet, amidst the grief, there was clarity. For the first time, I began to see my mother's fear not as an excuse, but as context. She had tried to protect me in the only way she knew how. She had tried to manage the world around me, to soften the edges, to shield me from what she thought would hurt too much. It wasn't kindness that was malicious, it was love, twisted with fear and secrecy. I spent days reflecting, quietly observing, taking small notes in my mind of patterns I had ignored before. How money was always redirected to keep appearances. How opportunities were delayed in the name of family balance. How questions were deflected gently, so politely, that I never noticed the control beneath. It was in this quiet observation that I began to recognize my own response. I realized that anger was not helpful, rage was a luxury I didn't need, what mattered was understanding. What mattered was clarity. I started to separate my emotions from the roles I had been assigned in my family: the obedient daughter, the quiet listener, the one who swallowed disappointment. This was the first step toward reclaiming myself. I didn't confront them immediately. There was no dramatic showdown, no shouting match, no tearful accusations. I simply began to notice the truth. I observed patterns, listened to conversations with new awareness, and allowed myself to feel the grief of betrayal without letting it define me. The note had opened a door. It didn't provide answers to everything, but it gave me permission to start looking. And as I held that permission in my hands, I felt the first flicker of power I had never known before, the power of awareness. By the time I left my parents' home after the wedding weekend, I knew one thing for certain. I could no longer blindly trust the narratives I had been given. I could no longer allow myself to be shaped entirely by others' choices. And most importantly, I realized that I could move forward in life without carrying the weight of their mistakes or their fears. It was a slow, quiet understanding, not a sudden revelation. But as I drove away that evening, watching the familiar streets pass by, I felt the first traces of a new kind of freedom: the freedom to notice, the freedom to question, the freedom to begin my life on my own terms, without illusions. For the first time in years, I felt the soft, steady pulse of my own inner strength beginning to grow. In the months after the wedding, I learned that understanding a betrayal isn't about confrontation, it's about observation. I didn't demand explanations, and I didn't insist on apologies. I simply watched, listened, and began to notice the patterns I had once overlooked. It started with small things: how my mother's eyes would flicker just slightly when a certain topic came up, how my father would laugh off questions that were meant to be serious, how relatives, even distant ones, seemed to hesitate before speaking around me, as if they were aware of something I wasn't. At first, I convinced myself it was coincidence, but deep down I knew it was not. Then came the documents. I asked politely for a copy of my childhood records, school transcripts, health documents, anything that belonged to me. The staff at my old school complied easily, unaware of the tension I carried inside. When I received them, I noticed discrepancies I had never questioned before: dates that didn't match the stories I was told, names that didn't align, allowances that were recorded but never explained. It wasn't a revelation with a single dramatic moment. There was no explosion of anger. Instead, it was a series of quiet realizations that built like a slow crescendo inside me. The truth was always there. I had just been looking in the wrong direction. I remember sitting at my childhood desk one evening, the same desk where I had once scribbled dreams of college, of love, of freedom. I spread the papers across the surface, my hands shaking slightly as I traced the lines of handwriting and official stamps. Each one felt like a small betrayal, a gentle but persistent proof that my family had managed my life in ways I hadn't fully understood. I thought of my mother's note, carefully folded in my nightstand. The words she had written no longer felt like an apology. They felt like a map, guiding me through a maze I hadn't realized I was trapped in. And yet, the closer I got to understanding, the more I felt a strange sense of clarity. I realized that this was not about villainy. No one had intended to hurt me in the way I feared. It was about control, about convenience, about keeping appearances. My parents' love had always been there, but it had been filtered, edited, carefully curated to protect themselves as much as to protect me. Even so, the sense of betrayal cut deep. I mourned quietly, not just the years of misplaced trust, but the life I thought I had lived. The version of myself who had believed blindly in their stories seemed almost like a stranger now. That innocence was gone, replaced by a steady awareness that allowed me to see the world clearly. I began to adjust my behavior. I stopped seeking approval for every small choice. I started asking questions, not for permission, but for understanding. I observed carefully who was honest and who was selective with the truth. And slowly, I built a quiet framework of emotional strength, a set of boundaries that no longer relied on others' assurances, only on my own discernment. Even interactions with my parents became different. I no longer assumed their intentions were purely kind, nor did I assume they were cruel. I treated their words with the same cautious respect I might show a delicate piece of glass, aware of the fragility, aware of the weight of past decisions, aware that the truth was mine to interpret. The most difficult moments were the silent ones, when I would watch family members laugh at stories I knew were half true, or when I would listen to casual remarks that exposed the hidden structure of our lives. I didn't call them out, I didn't argue, I let the silence do the work. In that quiet, I realized something powerful. Recognition of the truth is more enduring than confrontation. By the end of that year, the accumulation of small observations, patterns, and careful reflection had transformed me. I was no longer the trusting, gentle girl who had folded her life into the hands of others. I was calmer, more observant, more deliberate. I had learned to walk through a room, through a conversation, through life itself, with quiet vigilance and measured understanding. I had also discovered the limits of my own tolerance. Love, even family love, did not justify dishonesty or manipulation. I no longer allowed myself to carry the weight of others' mistakes as my own. I had begun the process of reclaiming not just my past, but my future. And in that calm, observant space, I began to feel something I had never felt before, the quiet power of inner strength. Not the kind that shouts or strikes, but the kind that watches, understands, and moves forward with dignity. It was a strength that didn't need validation, a strength that no deception could undermine, and a strength that would quietly guide me through whatever came next. By the time my first anniversary arrived, the note from my mother had been folded and refolded so many times that the paper had become soft at the creases. I still kept it in a drawer beside my bed, not out of nostalgia, but as a quiet reminder of the moment my life shifted. I had spent months observing, listening, and reflecting, and the cumulative weight of what I had discovered had changed me in ways I could barely describe. It wasn't anger that guided me anymore. It wasn't even grief. Those emotions had their place, but I had moved beyond them. What I carried now was clarity, and with clarity came the subtle but unshakable power of boundaries. The first step toward reclaiming my peace was deciding what I would no longer carry. I stopped explaining myself unnecessarily. I stopped bending to keep the peace at the cost of my own understanding. I stopped searching for approval from those whose love had always required compromise. Slowly, my interactions with my parents shifted. I was polite, but I was no longer pliable. I listened carefully, spoke deliberately, and allowed silence to carry what words could not. One evening, a few months after the wedding, my mother reached out. Her voice, usually so confident and precise, trembled. "Are we okay?" she asked. I paused. For a moment, I felt the familiar tug of old habits, the desire to reassure, to soften the tension. But I caught myself. My voice was calm, steady, and intentional. "We're fine," I said. but I'm not available for half-truths anymore. If we're going to have a relationship, it needs to be honest. Everything else doesn't work for me." There was a long silence on the line. Then a soft sigh. "I understand," she said, and that was it. No dramatic apologies, no tearful confessions. Just acknowledgement, the quiet recognition of boundaries I had set, and the first glimmer of respect for them. Life began to rearrange itself naturally. Some relationships softened, others drifted, but there were no explosions, no painful confrontations. The family gatherings that once carried invisible tension were now quieter, calmer, more honest, not because my parents had changed entirely, but because I had. I no longer allowed myself to be caught in the web of expectations and half-truths. At work, in my friendships, and even in my marriage, I carried this new awareness. I observed, I listened, and I responded thoughtfully. I no longer assumed that love required self-erasure, nor that loyalty demanded silence. The quiet power I had cultivated guided me, subtly but consistently. People noticed the change. They felt the calm strength in the way I held myself, the gentle authority in my decisions, and the unwavering clarity in my choices. There were moments of reflection, of course. Sometimes I would sit quietly in the morning sun with a cup of tea, thinking about the little girl I once was, the one who trusted too easily, who folded herself into other people's expectations, who believed that love meant swallowing disappointment. I felt a pang of sadness, yes, but it was mingled with gratitude. Because that girl had led me here to this strength, this awareness, this serenity, I also began to understand the quiet consequences of others' actions. My parents had lived in their carefully constructed world, believing it was the right way to protect me. Their choices had created distance, not devastation. And by holding my ground calmly, by honoring my boundaries without aggression, I had allowed natural consequences to unfold. I hadn't needed to punish anyone. Life had already shifted the balance in its own subtle, inevitable way. On the rare occasions we spoke of the past, I did so with observation, not accusation. I asked questions when necessary, accepted silence when it came, and made peace with the fact that truth is sometimes messy. I realized that forgiveness isn't always about absolution. Sometimes it's about understanding, setting limits, and moving forward without resentment. Now, when I reflect on my wedding day, I no longer see it as the day my world cracked open. I see it as the day my awareness began, the day I started to separate my story from the story that others had written for me, the day I began to walk forward with quiet dignity, carrying only what I chose to carry, leaving behind what I did not. I learned a lesson that resonates daily. Love that requires compromise of yourself. Worth is not love, and trust that comes with strings attached is not true trust. Real strength isn't loud or aggressive. It is calm, wise, and steady. It is the quiet assurance that you will not be diminished by the choices of others. And in that quiet, patient space, I finally found peace, not revenge, not drama, just clarity, just self-respect. Just the gentle, unwavering knowledge that I am enough, whole, and capable of walking my path without the weight of lies or hidden agendas. That was the gift my mother never knew she gave me when she pressed that note into my hand. Not the truth itself, but the opportunity to see clearly, choose wisely, and live fully.